like to welcome you all once again to this month's Wildlife for Lunch webinar. Today's webinar is on quail life history, focusing specifically on reproduction. Today's webinar is presented by Amanda Gobely. She is an Extension Associate with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. Today's webinar is made possible through funding provided by the San Antonio Livestock Exposition Incorporated, and it's hosted by the Texas Wildlife Association and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. Amanda, with that, you should have controls.
All right, thank you very much, Clint, and thank you all for being in attendance for the webinar today. Just a little bit more background about the program that I'm a part of. I am the Extension Associate who's been assigned to the Reversing the Quail Decline Initiative. This is a joint effort between Texas A&M AgriLife Extension and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and it's geared towards providing information and resources for the conservation and management of quail populations in Texas. So to that end today, we are going to be talking about a very important aspect of quail life history, which is reproduction. And when we say life history, when we use that phrase, what we're really referring to is the series of changes or phases that an organism goes through during its lifetime. And of course, you could argue that reproduction is going to be important for basically all species. But for quail, it is especially crucial because they rely on really high rates of reproduction to sustain their populations. I'd like to start off just giving an overview of how the program's going to go today. We'll begin by examining sort of the general quail reproductive strategy and looking at how that compares to strategies used by other species, both in terms of how many offspring are produced and the amount of investment that takes place in those offspring. Then we are going to get into some details about 3 key reproductive activities. We'll be talking about breeding, which is going to include the breakup of cubbies and the formation of mated pairs. We'll go into nesting, which will involve the selection of nesting sites, creation of the nest bowl, the laying of eggs, and the incubation of those eggs. And then finally, we'll be talking about brood rearing. So essentially, once you have made a successful nest and you've hatched those eggs out, what does it take to successfully raise a brood of chicks? And for each of these activities, we'll basically be going through what I like to call the nuts and bolts. So like what is happening, when is it happening, and what is causing it. We'll talk about some of the challenges that are associated with each. And then I'll also give just a very brief overview of what kinds of management practices can be implemented to support these activities. And this is not going to be heavily management focused, but if you would like more information on that, I can certainly provide you with some great resources on it. And finally, at the end, we will go over a summary of everything that we've learned here today. So I think it's important to start off considering what exactly the role of reproduction is in the greater quail equation. This is so that we can appreciate its importance. And I've got some metrics here that are going to help us do that. First of all, I'd like to ask you, what do you believe is the average lifespan of a quail in the wild? I'm going to guess that a lot of you have probably heard this value before, and if you think you know what it is, go ahead and hold it in your mind, and I will reveal that it is a mere 6 months. So that means that any individual quail, if it's really lucky, is going to survive long enough to see 1 breeding season. And it's a very rare case indeed when you have a bird that manages to last a year or longer, so they tend to be very short-lived. So given that their average lifespan is fairly short, what do you suppose is the annual rate of survival in terms of the percentage of a population that persists from year to year? Probably not too surprising that it's really only about 20 to 30%. So what that means is that only about 1/5 of the birds that are here now are going to still be here at the same time the following year. So essentially there's just a very high rate of attrition and very high turnover rate for our quail populations. And now you might be thinking, well, if the adults don't stay around very long, then what is the conversion rate of eggs to adult quail? It must be pretty high, right? Because we definitely have a significant number of adult quail that are out there. But actually, it's not really much more encouraging. It's only about 5 out of every 100 eggs, about 5%, that contribute an adult quail to the population at the end of the year. So given all these numbers, it may seem pretty incredible that we managed to keep quail around at all. But what it really shows us is the great importance that reproduction plays in the quail's life cycle and in sustaining its populations. Because if you're losing adults at this rate and the success rate for eggs is this low, then you need to be putting a lot of eggs out there in order to maintain and grow your quail. It's also useful to examine how the quail reproductive strategy fits in and compares with strategies of other species. And generally, any reproductive pattern that we see in nature falls somewhere along the spectrum, which has two extreme ends. At one end of the spectrum, we have what are called R-selected species. And these are organisms that tend to produce a lot of offspring, sometimes in the hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of offspring at a time, but they invest virtually no time or energy in raising those offspring. So a lot of insects, for example, tend to follow this pattern. And the ultimate result of that is that very few of those offspring survive, but simply by sheer probability and sheer numbers, enough of them do make it to adulthood that the population is able to persist. Then at the other end of the spectrum, we have what are called K-selected species. This is the other extreme, where these organisms produce very few offspring, but they have a large time and energy investment in them. So they do their best to ensure the continued survival and success of those offspring. Elephants are a really popular example, as are human beings. Tend to only produce a few offspring during our lifetimes, but we put a lot of effort into making sure that they're successful. If we consider where quail fall on that spectrum, we can safely say that they're probably somewhere in the middle, because they do tend to have fairly high rates of reproduction. Like a given clutch of quail eggs, on average, is going to have between 12 and 15 eggs in it, and there is potential for multiple clutches to be laid during breeding season per individual hen. But they also have a certain degree of parental investment, so those chicks are not entirely on their own after they're hatched. As you can see by this behavior right here, this hen is brooding her chicks. So she's essentially allowing them to get really close to her body and sharing her heat, allowing them to regulate their body temperature, and she's also concealing them from predators. So she does have a certain degree of investment in her young. However, if we really think about the bigger picture, we can say that quail tend to lean a little bit more towards the R side of that spectrum, because they do produce a lot of offspring, and the survival rate for those offspring is not super impressive. Actually, less than about 40% of chicks that are hatched are going to survive to 2 to 3 weeks of age. So there is a fairly high mortality rate there. That reproductive strategy is also one reason why we tend to see this pattern of boom and bust years in our quail populations. Because when you have a year where environmental conditions are really supportive of quail breeding efforts, then there is potential there to see a large increase in the population if a higher amount than normal managed to survive to adulthood. But the other side of that is that when conditions are not favorable for breeding, then you can also see an abrupt drop in the span of just 12 months if there's higher mortality rates than there normally are. So that is one thing that we have to keep in mind, and once again highlights the importance of supporting reproductive efforts in our quail. And the data that we're looking at here, by the way, are from Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's roadside counts for this year. Okay, so that's kind of our general overview of quail reproduction, and now we're going to start getting into the specifics of particular activities, starting with breeding. So this is going to include the breakup of our cubbies around the start of the spring and the formation of mated pairs, along with the environmental conditions and the physiological conditions that contribute to that change. This is a diagram that we're going to come back to at several points during the presentation today. I think it gives a really nice visual representation of quail life history and gives you a good idea of what exactly is going on in a quail's life at different times of the year. So as we talk about various activities, we're going to be focusing on different parts of this diagram, beginning right about here with the spring breakup and the formation of pair bonds. This activity happens primarily from about March through June, with the peak calling time happening around May. So that's when you can go out and hear the maximum number of bob white whistle mating calls out there in the prairie. Now, another important thing to note about a lot of these breeding activities is that as you head farther south and go to warmer latitudes, many of them begin a little bit earlier and can in some instances last a little longer. So it is highly temperature dependent as well. Let's think about what exactly is going on around this time, around the start of March, that is prompting changes in our quail. One of the most important factors here is that the quality and the duration of light is changing during this time. And we as people can, of course, observe this as well. We see that the days get a little bit longer, and we also tend to perceive that the sunlight seems to get a little bit more intense. And the quail are perceiving those changes just like we are. So one of the most dramatic changes that we see as a result of that is that prior to this point, during the winter months, we were able to go out and observe that the quail were in these large groups that we call coveys. That's an adaptive behavior that they use to get through the winter. It can keep each other warm and also have multiple pairs of eyes out there that are looking for predators. But when spring starts to come around, they perceive those lighting changes, and a cascade of hormones essentially prompts them to change that behavior. So instead of coveys, we now start to see that there are pairs of males and females that are wandering around out there. And in addition to those, we also observe that there are a lot of roosters that are finding high points and calling their little hearts out to try to attract a mate. There are thought to be a few other triggers that contribute to that switch, among which are an increase in food, an increase in available nesting sites, and also temperature down there, of course, is another big contributing factor. In fact, during years when you tend to have like an increase in temperature followed by an abrupt like cold front that comes through. In some cases, you can actually have quail revert from their pairs and get back into coveys, or it can delay the formation of those pairs. In addition, there are some specific changes that happen in each of the sexes. In the males, you're going to see that testes start to become enlarged and more active. During the non-breeding season, those testes are very, very small and they consume very little energy, which is excellent when you're trying to use your energy reserves to get through those winter months. But now that breeding season has started, they're going to be using them, and so they come out of dormancy. You also observe that males suddenly want very badly to be seen and heard. They're going to start seeking whistling perches, which is essentially any object that's between about 6 and 14 feet tall that the male can get on top of, and it causes his mating call, that characteristic bobwhite whistle, to carry a long distance, and it also allows females to see and find him. We also see that males start to exhibit some aggressive behavior. They might kind of charge at and attack other birds or just other animals in general, and again, that's due primarily to that flood of hormones. And in our females, we see that her ovary becomes active. She does have 2 ovaries, but there is only one that ever leaves dormancy and becomes active in producing eggs. As a result of that egg production, she also has vastly altered dietary requirements. Specifically, she needs a lot more protein than she did previously, and in fact consumes about 5 times the amount of insects as the roosters do during this time. Then she's also going to start exhibiting nesting behaviors. So she'll be seeking out nesting sites and starting to form nest bowls, and of course, seeking a rooster to mate with. It's also worth discussing the number of pairings that occur during the breeding season, because there was a time, not so long ago, really just a few decades, when it was thought that bobwhites and quail in general were entirely monogamous. Basically that they would simply pair up at the start of breeding season and that those pairs would persist for the entire time. We now know that the reality is very different, and in fact that both sexes will readily form multiple pairs and have extra pair copulations for the purpose of producing multiple nests. And that multiple nesting strategy is extremely important for the quail reproductive strategy in general, and we'll come back to that concept and discuss why that is in a few slides. There are several challenges that are associated with breeding. First of which is that there is a small breeding pool. So if you're starting out with a fairly small population, then it can be a little bit more daunting for each individual to find a mate. That is something that may occur if, for example, there's poor carryover of the population from winter. So if a lot of the birds die off during winter, then that's a smaller initial pool. It's also compounded by the fact that females tend to have higher rates of mortality than males do, and so they make up about 44 to 47% of the population versus an even 50. So they can sometimes be a limiting factor as well. Now, probably the biggest challenge to the process of breeding for quail is going to be stress. And in Texas, thermal stress is an especially large concern. It's thought that what happens here is that those stressors can interfere with the pathway of hormones that brings the birds into breeding condition. And so if they're not getting those hormonal cues, then they're not inclined to attempt to breed. And if that's not happening, then reproduction is being interfered with. You might be wondering, what can you do management-wise to facilitate breeding in quail? Honestly, this is an activity that if there is a sufficiently large quail population and if they have sufficient resources in the environment, it's going to take care of itself. But one thing that you can do is recognize the importance of loafing cover. And loafing cover helps out with breeding in a number of ways. First of all, it can help to reduce that thermal stress, which is a concern because it allows place for the birds to get out of the sun and to access some shade. It can also help to safeguard the population over winter. Because during winter, a lot of the vegetation is dormant. There's not nearly as much cover as there usually is. And so a good loafing covert can allow for protection from predators and also help the quail to keep warm. And in terms of what it looks like, for a loafing covert, we're mostly aiming for low-growing woody plants, which might include like a young mesquite, chittenwood trees, plum thickets are really excellent. And it's going to be about 4 feet tall, about 10 feet across, and it should be spaced such that you can stand in one covert and reach the next one within a softball throw, because that's about as far as a quail is willing to travel to get from one covert to another. That about sums it up for breeding, and now I'd like to go ahead and move on to the process of nesting, which includes finding a place to nest, constructing that nest bowl, and then laying and incubating the eggs. And in my opinion, this is going to be one of the most complex and challenging aspects of reproduction for a quail. And we're going to come on back to our diagram here and look at where we've moved to. Which as we go clockwise around the circle here, we are now focused on the nesting and brooding part of it down near the bottom. The peak of this activity is going to take place from about May through August, with most hatches occurring in kind of like June and July. It's important to note, again, that there are late hatches that are very possible, especially as you move farther down south and get to lower latitudes where it stays warmer longer. And in some parts of southern Texas, you can actually see hatches happening in October and even November. One of the most important things to keep in mind about nesting is that it takes time, and really a lot of time, probably more even than you're anticipating that it takes, because there are a lot of activities around the actual laying and incubating of the eggs that are also important, but also time-consuming. So let's go through a breakdown of that. The first step is going to be the nest construction. So what that means is that the hen is going to have to find a place to lay her eggs, and she's a ground-dwelling and ground-nesting bird, so she's looking for substrates on the ground that are suitable. And when she finds a spot, she's going to have to scratch out and dig out a little indentation to serve as the nest bowl. And that whole process is going to take about 5 days. The next step is especially time-consuming, where she's actually laying her clutch of eggs. And on average, bobwhites are going to lay between 12 and 15 eggs per clutch. And bobwhite hens, like a lot of other birds, are capable of laying at most 1 egg per day. So if we take that into account and realize that there are probably going to be some days where she just doesn't lay an egg for whatever reason, then we can safely allocate 18 to 20 days for that activity. There also is frequently a delay between when the last egg is laid and when incubation starts. And she is going to want to wait until all the eggs have been laid before she begins incubation, because she wants to make sure that all the eggs hatch at about the same time. So between 1 day and 1 week is usually the delay there. And then finally, there's the process of incubation itself, where you have either the male or the female. Both are capable of incubating. About 20% of nests are going to be incubated by the rooster. And that will take a total of 23 days. We have a pretty good handle on that number. That is the time from the start of incubation to hatch. So if we add up all those numbers, we find that the process of nesting successfully from start to finish is going to require about 50 days. And when your breeding season is really just 3 or 4 months, then that is a significant time commitment. bearing in mind that there are going to be nest attempts that are not successful, so some of them are not going to get through the whole process. But if you want to do it right and actually get chicks on the ground as a result of your breeding efforts, then that is the amount of time that it has to take. We should also talk a little bit more about these nesting substrates that I've hinted at. Essentially, where are the eggs laid? And there are several different types of vegetation that a quail can potentially use as a nesting substrate, which have their own advantages and disadvantages. Bunch grasses are one really common type of nesting substrate, and that's going to include things like the big blue stem that's pictured here, as well as like little blue stem, thrionds, past balance species, anything with a similar structure to that. And bunch grasses are really great as substrate because they provide a little bit of insulation, so they can help to keep the eggs at the right temperature, and provided that they are large enough and tall enough, they can also allow for some concealment from predators that are looking to eat the hen or eat the nest. Shrubby plants, such as the juniper that's in the picture on the left here, can also make really great nesting substrates. And in fact, the juniper in this particular photo is housing a quail nest. So this hen has chosen wisely, obviously, because it's very difficult to see that nest. They also add some physical protection, because the woody part of the plant can be a deterrent. And some other examples include like sagebrush and yucca and things of that structure. Then at the bottom here we have a prickly pear, which frankly nobody really likes prickly pear except the quail quite enjoy using it as a nesting substrate. One advantage to that is obviously the physical protection that the pear spines provide, because if you're a predator that's looking to eat a nest, but you have to dive into a pear patch to do it, then that's going to be a pretty decent deterrent. And another bonus from the prickly pear is that quail will actually utilize those pear fruits as a food source, so it has that benefit as well. Now we're going to come on back to this concept of multiple nesting. I had hinted that this was important, and now we're going to see why. It was a thing that was actually previously thought to be impossible for quail. It was believed that at most quail could produce one successful brood in a breeding season, and that was their limit. But around the late 80s, when we started to experiment with radio telemetry and made use of that technology, we were able to follow individual birds and to see what they did and where they went. And we learned very quickly that not only was multiple nesting not impossible, it was quite possible, it was also fairly common, and it was an important aspect of quail reproductive strategy. Now, it's important to note that when you have multiple nesting attempts, the mean clutch size, the average number of eggs per clutch, is going to go down in subsequent attempts, and that's primarily because of limited resources. It takes a lot of time and energy to make those eggs, and the hen is limited in the amounts of energy she can devote to it. And the real value of multiple nesting isn't even necessarily that we can expect, every hen to have at least 2 or more successful broods, although there have been instances where hens successfully hatch 2, 3, or even 4 clutches. But really, the biggest advantage for this technique is that it gives each hen multiple chances to get at least 1 brood on the ground during breeding season. Because the fact is that really only about 40 to 50% of nests are going to hatch successfully. So it's basically a coin toss with any given nest as to whether you're going to get chicks as a result of it. But when you're flipping that coin multiple times during the breeding season, then your chance of success goes up by quite a bit. Now, there are several challenges that are associated with nesting, not the least of which is predators. There are all kinds of predators out there that will happily make a meal out of a quail nest. Those eggs in there don't move around much, they don't have really any defense to speak of, and they're an excellent source of calories and protein. So just about anything that eats protein out there will be happy to eat these eggs. I've got some pictures of some very common nest predators here, including raccoons, feral hogs, and corvids like crows and ravens. The list also includes foxes, bobcats, rodents, even things like wild turkeys. So it is a long list for sure. And predators account for about 84% of nest failures. So these are the expected, naturally occurring, and quite high rates of nest predation. The other major challenge to nesting relates to temperature once again. It is heat and drought. drought conditions can really be disastrous for quail breeding for a number of reasons. First off, when you're in a severe drought, you tend to see fewer hens that are nesting. Once again, that may be due in part to the stress interfering with them going into reproductive condition. You end up getting fewer nesting attempts per hen, and you get a shorter nesting season. So not only is the effort lowered, but the time that they have to breed is shortened as well. For the eggs themselves, you tend to see lower egg production, lower hatchability, and overall lower survivability of the embryos. So with all those factors combined, it can lead to a rather subpar breeding season. Management for nesting centers primarily around providing the quail with adequate substrate. You want to give them a variety of nesting sites to choose from, and you want those nesting sites to be of high quality. And as we said, bunch grasses are a really popular type of substrate. So if you're trying to get or maintain bunch grasses on your property, the size that you should aim for is a clump that's at least, so minimum, 8 inches tall and 12 inches wide. And that's going to be about the size of a basketball. Now, it's worth noting that for a lot of species of bunch grasses, to attain a size like that, it actually takes quite a bit of time. It can take a couple of years. So by far the best management strategy is if you already have clumps of that size, do your best to protect them and maintain them. In terms of density, what you want to aim for is about 300 clumps per acre. So if you're not hitting a suitable nesting substrate about every 8 to 10 steps you take on your property, you'll probably want to try to increase that a little bit. And the key to achieving this is going to be a moderate amount of disturbance. And some techniques for achieving that disturbance include the use of fire. Also fire followed by disking during like the cool, frosty months is a really effective strategy. And cattle are also a super effective tool. If you put them out there and allow them to graze to about an average bunch grass height of between 12 and 18 inches, then you should be in pretty good shape. That about does it for nesting, and now we'll be moving on to the brood rearing phase of quail reproduction. This is after, if you're a quail, you've had a successful hatch, and there are now little chicks that are going to be following their parents around in the prairie that are able to feed themselves, but still require a little bit of help from their parents. So we'll examine some of the challenges that are associated with this. Coming back to our diagram for a final time, we've now moved clockwise a little bit farther and are now focused in on the brooding and the late nesting portion of the diagram. So most of this activity is going to be happening from about August to September, but it's important to note that brooding and nesting activities are often occurring concurrently. So for example, if you have a hen who is successful on her very first nesting attempt, then she's going to have chicks on the ground and she's going to be leading a brood at the same time that another hen may be making a second nesting attempt. So this is just kind of a general guideline, but it is perfectly normal to be seeing some nesting and brood rearing happening at the same time. In order to understand the challenges and requirements that chicks have, I think it's important to look at how they grow up. And so to do that, we can examine some specific milestones of their growth and development. Within 3 to 4 days of hatching, that chick is going to start developing its primary feathers. And those primaries are going to be the long feathers on the wing that are used for flight. And really, this just goes to illustrate how rapidly the chicks start to undergo physical changes after they hatch. Chicks that are less than a week old are going to require intensive brooding by the parent. So once again, brooding is that activity that we saw in a previous slide where the parent gathers the chicks close to his or her body and kind of shares his or her body heat with those chicks. At this stage, they just are not very good at regulating their own temperature, and so they require a lot of attention. Within 2 weeks, our quail chicks are actually starting to fledge, so they can actually begin to fly at this time. They can get themselves off the ground. And as someone who has raised a quail chick from hatching to adulthood, this is actually the chick that I raised that's pictured here. His name is Kirby Quail, and he's our unofficial mascot for the Quail Decline Initiative. I was very surprised when around 2 weeks of age, Kirby was suddenly able to escape the open-topped box that I had been keeping him in, so I very rapidly had to find a new setup for him. Within 5 weeks, the chicks now have enough juvenile plumage in order to survive moderate weather events. So prior to this point, something like a heavy rain would essentially be a death sentence for these chicks. They really cannot afford to get wet. But now they've lost enough of that natal down that they can actually endure that pretty effectively. And it also means that they don't require such intensive brooding by their parent anymore. Between 8 to 10 weeks is when we now have full juvenile plumage that's appeared, and you're also starting to be able to recognize the sex of the chick. This picture here is actually Kirby at about 8 weeks of age, and this is when I started to get the inkling that I maybe had a rooster instead of a hen, for obvious reasons, as you can see. I had been told previously by somebody who tried to feel the pelvic bones that I most definitely had a female, and it was around this time that I began to suspect that that was not the case. Within 12 to 13 weeks now, our juvenile has basically full adult plumage, so there is no doubt in anybody's mind looking at that bird's head which gender you have. And within 15 weeks, our quail has now reached sexual maturity. So it's important to note there, though, that even though sexual maturity has technically been attained, no breeding is going to happen until the start of spring. So they do actually have to make it through that winter initially. Now, one of the most significant requirements for chicks specifically is in their diet. And primarily it's because chicks require extremely high amounts of protein in their diet. Within the first 2 weeks of their life, they're going to be eating more than 80% insects, and that's because insects are really the only food source out there that has enough density of protein and calories in order to support their growth. And in fact, it's going to be between 6 to 8 weeks before most of their nutritional needs can be met, primarily through vegetation. Now, as we said, the hen also has vastly increased protein needs as well, so having a high density of insects out there in the habitat benefits her too. Now, the good news is that if you are trying to foster good, diverse quail habitat, and if you have adequate vegetation out there, then the insects are going to come to you. You really don't have to do anything extra. They're going to show up if the habitat quality is where it needs to be. And speaking of habitat quality, we should really talk about that specifically with regards to quail chicks. And for this, I would like you guys to imagine that you are seeing the world through the eyes of a quail chick. So that means that you are going to be about 2 inches tall, you're newly hatched, you're not very good at regulating your body temperature, you can move around, at least move around well enough to follow your brothers and sisters and follow your parents, but you're really not very good at it yet. So if you are a quail chick, do you think that you would be able to navigate habitat like this very effectively? I'm going to go ahead and say that the answer is probably going to be no. This is what we call a sod-forming grass. Okay, we can distinguish between sod-forming and bunch grasses, which we discussed before. And sod-forming varieties tend to grow in kind of just a wide sheet across the landscape, and they tend to be very thick at the ground level. So that's a problem if you're a tiny quail chick, because now you're having to struggle through this thick grass. And as an added challenge, the blades of this grass are not very tall. So as you're struggling to get around, you also are not being concealed very effectively by predators, and you're exposed to sun. So this is really not ideal in terms of brood rearing habitat. What we want instead for our broods of chicks is a habitat with a particular structure. And there are many different plants that can give us the structure that we're looking for. But essentially, what we want is vegetation that has sort of a leafy canopy. So there's a lot of leaves or petals near the top of the plant, but it remains fairly open close to the base of the plant. And what that does is it forms a nice canopy and a nice shelter that allows the chicks to have some refuge from the heat, it provides them with shade, and it also conceals them from aerial predators that are looking to eat them. In addition to that, because they remain open close to the base of the plant, it forms little corridors underneath that canopy that they can use to get around fairly easily. So that's excellent because it means that their movement isn't inhibited and they can find food much more easily than if they were trying to struggle through thick grass. Some of the examples, by the way, that I've shown here are, here's a sunflower. A lot of native Texas wildflowers do have that particular structure that we're looking for. And then to the right of the sunflower, we have a croton, which has excellent brood-rearing cover structure and also doubles as a really great food source for quail. And then at the bottom, we have annual broomweed, which is sort of the quintessential example of the type of vegetation that we're looking for, with that bushy top and that open base. Now, quail chicks also have very specific temperature needs, which is sort of illustrated by this quote, which is from On Bob White. It states that a bobwhite chick exposed to full sun could die in 122 seconds. And that seems really insanely fast, but it is the truth, because the fact is that quail, in general, are in constant danger of overheating. And even the adults have a very high operational body temperature. They live in a very hot environment. So if they don't have a way to escape the heat, then it can turn deadly very quickly. And quail chicks are even worse off, unfortunately, because they're born with this natal down, this very fluffy plumage, which is certainly better than nothing, but which is not nearly as effective as adult plumage for thermoregulation. And on top of that, they're very small, which means that their temperature can change rapidly in a short time scale. So essentially, the way that you help chicks deal with their temperature requirements is you give them that habitat. You give them access to shade, to loafing cover, just allow them to have the resources that they need to escape the heat. And how exactly do we do that? How do we manage to support brood-rearing activities in our environment? Once again, mechanical disturbance during kind of cool weather months is a really good practice to implement. And that can include things like disking or the use of cattle. So cattle, you get both the grazing aspect and the hoof traffic aspect that contribute to disturbance. You can also burn sort of through December, from December through to March. I want you to note also that sort of the cutoff for these activities is going to be March, because at that point is when reproduction is starting to get going. So once that process begins, you really don't want to do any kind of intensive management that's going to interfere with that. You want to let those activities take place. You can also divert water to some specific areas of the property in order to support really thirsty forms. That may be as simple as just like digging a ditch alongside a road and channeling the water off to some specific area. We have a really great YouTube video actually on our channel called Quail Oases, which goes into some detail about this. And some people also choose to construct food plots on their property. So they might go out there and plant milo or millet, which of course provides food for the quail. And many of those crop plants also have that ideal structure that we're looking for as well. In my opinion, though, the best investment of time and energy is going to be fostering the growth of those native plants, which are already out there in the seed bank. They just need the right conditions in order to show up the following spring. Whenever doing any kind of management to support quail, it's important to remember that you should aim for a patchwork of habitat types. So you don't want like a huge swath of only nesting habitat next to all of your brood-rearing habitat in another large area. You want nesting and brood-rearing and loafing cover all interspersed within a relatively short distance, because quail on average really do not travel very far, and they need to be able to access all of their resources and have all of their needs met within a fairly short distance. Okay, so if we summarize what we've been talking about today, we have learned that for successful breeding, a quail is going to need the right mix of hormones, which is dependent in part on environmental cues and environmental factors, and of course they also need to find a partner. We know that for successful nesting, a quail is going to need an adequate nesting substrate. It's going to need the right nutrition to support those nesting efforts, including the laying of eggs. And this is kind of a thing that's more luck than anything else, but they are also going to require favorable weather. And in fact, some rain events, depending on what time they happen during the breeding process, can either greatly support nesting efforts or they can completely sabotage them. If you have a really heavy rain, for example, like close to the start of breeding season, then that can actually prompt some of the vegetation that we're desiring to come out a little bit later. But if that rain event is happening when eggs are already on the ground, then in some cases those eggs can actually be drowned or washed away. So as I said, there is an element of luck that's there. For successful brood rearing, a quail is going to need that chick-friendly brood rearing habitat that we just finished discussing. And then they also need that increased nutrition so that those chicks have the protein and the calories in order to grow. Okay, and with that, I would like to say thank you. Thank you to Texas A&M AgriLife Extension and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for working together on the Reversing the Quail Decline initiative. I'd like to thank the Texas Wildlife Association for hosting the webinar today. And I would especially like to thank all of you, the students of Quail, who have taken an interest in this topic and have decided to be here today to make use of this information and to ask some questions. Speaking of questions, in just a few minutes, I'm going to take whatever questions you have. But if you think of something else later, or if we don't get to yours for whatever reason, please feel free to email me at agobly@tamu.edu. I'll be happy to chat with you with whatever you're worried about or wondering about. And if you'd like any additional resources on anything that I've discussed, I'd be happy to provide those as well.
Very good. Thank you very much, Amanda. We do have some questions for you. It looks like we have some more coming in now. I would encourage everybody to continue to post questions up into the chat window, and we'll get to them in the order that they come in. I do want to point out one more quick thing, something that we're going to do new this year. For those of y'all who are still on, if you do fill out the exit survey once the webinar is done, excuse me, you'll be entered into a drawing at the end of the year after the very last webinar. We're going to draw for a dove hunt for two at Paloma Pachanga out in Hondo and a Yeti cooler. So any webinar you watch, if you fill out the exit survey at the end, you will get entered into the drawing, one per webinar. So a little incentive to help us out with some of that information at the end of the webinar. So jumping into questions, question number one, early on you mentioned the breakup of the covey. What does a breakup of a covey mean?
Okay. So yeah, essentially just what that means is that near to the end of winter, as I said, when we start to see those changes take place in the environment, when the days are getting longer, food and nesting sites are becoming more available, and the hormones are just prompting the quail to change their behavior. So whereas before they were very content to roam around in these big groups that we call coveys. So if you've been out walking in the pasture recently and you've flushed a huge group of birds, that is what we refer to as a covey. But when the covey breaks up, essentially those birds separate. So instead of wandering around in this big group, they're going to pair up with a bird of the opposite sex. And that's really the event that sort of kicks off the breeding season, is now they're going off into mated pairs as opposed to roaming around in a big group.
Okay, question about predators. Are roadrunners nest predators or chick predators?
Okay, that's an excellent question. It's actually something that I had looked into specifically fairly recently. There has been a lot of research done as to the extent to which roadrunners predate on quail, quail eggs and quail chicks. Honestly, there's at least one study, where they examined the stomach contents of about 80 roadrunners, and they did manage to find remains of a couple of quail chicks within those stomach contents. Now, it certainly didn't imply that roadrunners were a significant predator of quail chicks, but it is most definitely possible. A roadrunner is very opportunistic, very generalistic in terms of what it eats. So if it comes across a chick that is young enough that it can catch, then there's no reason to think that it wouldn't potentially eat it. But in terms of the behavior that we actually observed and the contents of the stomach that we're actually able to analyze, it doesn't appear that they're a significant part of the roadrunner's diet. In terms of how broods react to roadrunners, there have actually been behavioral observations made where the parents will exhibit defensive behavior towards roadrunners when the chicks are basically a certain size. So when they're like very young, newly hatched, very, very vulnerable, then the parents will kind of charge at the roadrunners and display a lot of aggression towards them as if they perceive them to be a threat. But once those chicks get a little bit bigger, start to get some of their juvenile plumage in, then broods and roadrunners can coexist in the same area and completely ignore each other. So it appears that there is sort of an age component to that, where beyond which the roadrunner will not really pay attention to the chicks at all. But in any event, in terms of being a nest or like a brood predator, possible, but really not a significant contributing factor.
Okay. Next question is on multiple nestings. Can you elaborate a little bit on how quail have multiple nests a year? Do they build a nest, lay the eggs, incubate, move on, have another nest, or do they wait for one to fail before they start?
Sure. Short answer is kind of all of the above. It really kind of depends. In some cases, like a female will go out and select a nest site, and she'll even go so far as to make a nest bowl, and then for whatever reason, she'll just pick up and go find another nest site. Why? We don't know. Maybe she found something better. But a lot of times what will happen with multiple nesting is that the female will lay a clutch of eggs, and then she can actually have the rooster sit on that clutch while she goes and makes another nesting attempt with some other partner. So that's one way that it can happen. And then probably the most common way that multiple nesting is implemented in reproductive strategy is that a nesting attempt is made, that attempt fails, so the nest gets predated or the eggs don't hatch for whatever reason, and then she abandons that nest site and goes off to form another nest somewhere else. So it really just depends with what specific challenges she's encountering in the environment at the time.
Okay. Do quail chicks eat on their own on day one, and do quail prefer any particular insect species or just whatever they can find?
That is also actually a really good question that I have had some experience with firsthand. Once again, when I was raising little Kirby quail, I had kind of a panicked moment within the first few days of his life, actually, because I was observing that he was not eating. And I wondered what was going on, so I had to go and actually consult with some people who knew more about it than me, who informed me that he was actually still feeding off of the yolk, interestingly enough. So really within the first day or two, quail chicks are not going to be doing a whole lot of eating, because what has happened is that towards the end of their development inside the egg, they have absorbed the remainder of the yolk, and they are sustaining themselves off that. But really within a couple of days, they do begin to start eating, and they do that behavior entirely on their own, at least as far as bobwhite chicks are concerned. And in terms of what insects they prefer, essentially it's going to be anything close to their level that can fit in their mouth. Very often that's going to be grasshoppers, sometimes little flies, little leaf hoppers, things like that. Just really anything that they are able to catch and swallow, they will be happy to eat.
Okay. How can you keep quail, in these words, stimulated in their environment? Is it sufficient enough just to make sure that there's enough insects?
So I guess I would be wondering for some clarification on stimulated. Insects are going to be a really important food source. And as we said, it's especially crucial for chicks and hens during that breeding season. Later on, like vegetation is going to be a really important part of their food source, especially as we get closer to winter. Like, if any of you guys have been out hunting and have observed quail crops, there's an awful lot of crops out there that you'll find right now that are full of vegetation because that's what's available. In terms of like mental stimulation, if that's more what the question is asking, quail are pretty easy to keep occupied. Like if you're trying to raise quail just as like a hobby, for example, they really don't require a whole lot in terms of entertainment. They do enjoy chasing insects to some extent. They also like to dust bathe, and that's pretty much what they require.
Okay. Average lifespan of a quail in captivity?
I have heard a lot of different reports on what the lifespan of a quail is, removed from all kinds of natural challenges, predation and finding food and all that. I've heard that it can be around 5 years, and I've also heard stories that it can be potentially much longer than that. So I'll tell you that, like Kirby right now, who is living a life of luxury as far as quail are concerned, is currently a little over 2 years old, and he's still looking very good. So it's definitely many times the natural lifespan, and potentially several years.
Okay. Can you introduce quail into your habitat?
So you can, and that's a thing that a lot of people do try to do. They'll basically pen raise a group of quail and then release them into the environment to try to get them to breed. And this has been a major point of debate and of research in the quail community for many years. The sticking point being, how exactly do you get these pen-raised birds to survive in the wild? Because the fact is that according to everything we know, they just do not survive very well. They don't last very long. Sometimes it's a matter of days, and sometimes it's a matter of weeks. But generally, they just have a really hard time living long enough to actually breed. So people have experimented with trying to acclimate them to the environment beforehand, trying to release them at certain times so that maybe they can get one breeding attempt in before they get eaten by something. It has been found that birds that manage to integrate themselves with a wild covey tend to do a lot better than those that stick with their pen-raised friends or go off on their own. But ultimately, it's a very, very small percentage of pen-raised birds that are going to survive, if any of them do at all. So, it is something that you can do, and we are still working on trying to figure out how to make that strategy more effective, but you really have to kind of temper your expectations of success with that.
Okay. How well do they survive in the cold? And then also on the heat side of thing, is there a specific temperature that gets too hot for them?
Yeah, so with the cold, winter months are really extremely challenging for quail, unfortunately. We saw that only about 20% of the population persists from year to year, and much of that is due to high rates of winter die-off. That's due to the fact that there's really not a lot of food out there, there's not a lot of cover, and on top of that you have low temperatures to contend with. So it is a tough time. They do manage to get through it, once again, because they join up into coveys. You may have seen the behavior before of circling up, where you'll have a covey of birds that will get into a really tight circle, and they'll all kind of fluff their feathers, and that allows them to share body heat and to keep warm during especially cold nights. And it also gives them kind of a 360 view of the prairie so that everybody can watch for predators at the same time. So that's their primary strategy for dealing with that. And in terms of temperature, struggling to think of if there's a specific maximum temperature that an adult bobwhite can endure. But essentially, the way that quail are going to deal with really hot temperatures is with certain behaviors. So when they begin to get really hot, they can alleviate some of that by doing a behavior called gular fluttering, which I guarantee you've seen birds do before. It's where they open their mouth and kind of pant a little bit. They can also, of course, move themselves to a location that is less hot. So they're going to go and find a loafing covert. Most of the time is what they use. Sometimes a standing water source is also something that they can utilize. And essentially, unless it's really extremely hot temperatures, if the habitat quality is there, then they can move to a cooler part of that habitat. Now for eggs, of course, are not mobile, so their temperature requirements are going to be a little bit different. And generally, the upper lethal limit for eggs in terms of temperature is going to vary according to the time of exposure, but it's typically between about 115 and 124 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, that's 46 and 51 degrees Celsius. So at around temperatures that high, you start to rapidly see eggs that are just not going to hatch. It's essentially egg mortality that's happening at that point.
Sorry about that. Let's see, does improving soil quality and maintaining moisture content help the soil, help the quail habitat?
Absolutely. I'm not a soil expert, so you'd have to talk to somebody else about the specific ways to achieve that on your property, but like as I was describing with the brood-ring habitat, a lot of those weedy plants, like a lot of those fords that we're looking for, do tend to be some of the thirstier plants, so they require a little bit higher moisture content. So having that moisture content in your soil can certainly help improve your chances of getting that habitat out there. And I mean, of course, the higher quality your soil is, the greater diversity of plant life you're going to be able to support there. And really, diversity and mixture of different vegetation types and vegetation species is probably the key component to quail habitat management. So maintaining your soil and keeping it healthy is going to be really helpful with that.
Okay, can you elaborate a little bit on what disking is?
Sure. So disking is basically a technique where you have a large piece of equipment, kind of like a piece of construction equipment that has like a roller on the front of it that has discs that are positioned all along that roller. And you essentially run those discs over the property, and that kind of churns up the soil a little bit. And with disking, it's a thing that you tend to want to do in like long strips. So you'll just kind of like drive a big strip down the length of your property that's it's going to be, let me see if I can remember here. It's going to be a strip like about 30 to 50 feet wide, and then you want to space those about 60 to 100 feet apart. Okay, so you want to disturb the soil in these long areas, and that disturbance essentially allows seeds that are in the seed bank in that soil to be able to germinate. So it removes some of the older succession plants that are there and gives some of the lower succession plants a chance to germinate and establish themselves. So like if you have a property that hasn't been disturbed in a long, long time, and it's full of like older plants, so like one thing that tends to happen, for example, is you get like a lot of woody plants and trees, and sometimes you can even get like too high density of bunch grasses. And if that's the case, and you instead want to see some areas where more of those weeds and forbs are showing up, then disking and disturbing the soil in that manner is a really good technique to use. But it's important to remember that the time to do that is going to be during the cold months prior to the breeding season.
When coveys break up and pair off, do they always pair up with birds from another covey, or do they pair within their coveys as well?
Yeah, that's actually something that I was trying to get clarification on recently. So I don't for sure know what the correct answer is to that, but I would suspect that they are probably not all that discerning. I know that in the behaviors that I've observed, they kind of seem to be happy to pair with, you know, whoever, whatever is in the vicinity. And I mean, one thing about that is prior to the formation of coveys, we have what's called the fall shuffle, which you may have heard that term as well, which is when kind of the individual broods will sort of separate and form coveys that are a little more diverse. So instead of having, you know, just a covey that's all members of one brood, you'll have members from different families. So that makes me think that there could potentially be like mated pairs that arise from that same covey, since there is like genetic diversity there. But honestly, I'm not sure of the extent to which pairs are formed inside and outside of the covey.
Okay. Are pesticide uses on insects a problem for quail?
That is also a really, really good question, and this was one of the topics of my thesis research, actually, that I was looking at for my master's. My particular area of interest there was with the neonicotinoid insecticides, which you may have heard of in relation to like honeybee declines and things of that nature. They are really kind of the the new big variety of insecticide that's being used. And I will tell you that, first of all, quail are a lot hardier than a lot of other species in terms of like toxin levels that they can tolerate. There are many types of songbirds which experience mortality at extremely low levels of a toxin, like a single seed coated in certain pesticides can kill certain songbirds. So bobwhites tend to be a little hardier than that. But in terms of like the direct correlation between like insects killed by insecticide in the field and bobwhites dying as a result of that exposure, some of that is still being investigated. Although in studies examining like concentrations of insecticides found in like bobwhite's body tissues, they appear to be very low concentrations, and in certain cases, like rare instances, where broods have been present in fields that were actively treated with insecticides, there really wasn't any noticeable increase in mortality in those particular broods. So it appears that they're able to withstand those effects fairly effectively. But another thing to keep in mind with that is that mortality is a very easy thing to measure because the bird is either going to be alive or it's dead. But there are sublethal effects that could potentially be at work there. So, for example, if you have a hen that's exposed to insecticide and if she lays eggs, if it's the kind of insecticide that can be transferred to those eggs, then it could potentially impact the development of the embryos. And that is a much more challenging thing to measure and to evaluate. So, essentially, based on what we have seen so far, it looks like most insecticides don't have a dramatic effect on quail populations, but there is potential that they could be having effects that we are not seeing. So essentially, if you can minimize insecticide use as much as possible, that is likely the best policy.
Can you touch on supplemental feeding and maybe offer any suggestions?
Sure. So supplemental feeding is another practice that a lot of people like to try to use to increase quail populations. In cases where feed is very scarce, so like sometimes during really intense winters, for example, when quail are out there and really struggling to feed themselves, supplemental feed can be a decent strategy. And I mean, in terms of actually putting feed out there, there's a really simple method for it called the Curie quail feeder. Try saying that 3 times fast. Which is basically just like a barrel with a little hole near the base of it, which allows like some kind of small seed, like Milo, for example, to be distributed to the quail. We've also got another really excellent video on that if anyone's interested in seeing it. The thing about it, though, is that most of the time, food is not going to be a limiting factor on quail populations. So as long as there is enough vegetation out there to be producing seed and to be harboring insects, usually quail don't really have a problem feeding themselves. And more often, if there is a limiting factor out there, it's related to the structure or the diversity of the habitat rather than simply the amount of food that is available. And on top of that, like providing supplemental feed can potentially be a very expensive thing. And there's also some information suggesting that if you have feed concentrated in one area, then you're going to be attracting all the quail to that one area. And in addition to that, you may also be attracting all the predators to that area. So while you may be feeding the quail, you might also be ringing the dinner bell for their enemies. So you got to keep that in mind as well.
Okay, back to a question earlier about insecticide use. What about herbicide use?
Herbicide use is going to kind of be along the same lines. That's an area that I have less personal expertise in. But once again, I haven't heard specifically of like modern types of herbicides that are being used that are dramatically impacting quail populations. It is possible that there are some out there that I just have not personally read about. But I mean, in general, with any pesticide, any insecticide, any herbicide, any fungicide, there's always the potential there for sublethal effects that we haven't figured out yet. I mean, there are plenty of examples of cases where you have, some kind of chemical like that has managed to pass, laboratory testing. And then when it gets into the environment, unpredictable things happen, and it has effects that nobody anticipated. And that's just a factor of the complexity and a huge sample size that you get when you use one of these chemicals on a large scale. So, I mean, in general, if you can find other ways to manage for like undesirable weeds and undesirable insects, like integrated pest management is a really great concept that tries to minimize pesticide use and gives you some alternatives to control for those pests that you want to get rid of. And I think that's a really great option versus the use of pesticides.
Okay. Because of our time, I don't want to go too long. We'll ask one last question that kind of ties everything together. Is there any sort of a calendar almost that you could suggest people follow for management of a quail throughout the year?
Yes, absolutely. We actually have recently put out an app. Of course, there's an app for that, which is in fact a Bob White management calendar. So it's essentially exactly what you're looking for. It's got kind of a very simple set of guidelines for each month of the year, what you should be thinking about doing with regards to managing for quail populations. And that is available on both iPhone and Android, and it's completely free, so you can go ahead and search for it, just Bob White Management Calendar, and you can go ahead and download that, and that'll do a lot towards getting you started. And then if you have any questions about the specific activities that are listed in that app, we have publications and videos and plenty of other resources that can help explain and illustrate those activities for you.
Okay. I just posted a link for the App Store in the calendar, and then let me grab the link right here for Google Play. And so both of those are now in the chat window. And while we're on posting links, I want to give y'all a handful more links. Right now, if you go to the chat window, you'll see a wildlife.tamu.edu Quail link. So there's some resources from AgriLife Extension on Quail. I'm also going to give you a link to a series of videos called Quail Posts that were done through AgriLife and Texas Wildlife Association. It's a YouTube link. It's got, there's 23 videos in that playlist, so you can watch any and all of them. And I would also like to post a link to this recording. So if in the future you want to go back, watch this, jot down some notes, just go back and see what the questions were, you can follow that link. I'll leave this page up in the chat window again. That way y'all can go grab those links before we take off. Another thing to point out, since this is the first webinar of the year, is the link that just popped up in the chat window is the Wildlife for Lunch webinar series schedule for the entire year. Please look at that and see if there's anything else that's of interest to you. The next webinar is going to be on February 23rd. We're going from quail to water. We're going to look at aquatic plant identification and control options, also done by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension employee Dr. Todd Sink out of College Station. I think that's all the links that I have to share. There's maybe a couple questions that we didn't get to, but like I said, I want to keep it sort of in our time range. So, Amanda, do you have anything else to follow up with?
I think that's about it. Just once again, for those of you whose questions did not get answered, feel free to send me an email or even give me a phone call. So I'm always available to answer questions.
That sounds great. I really appreciate the time to give the presentation. Wonderful as always. Great turnout. And for those of you who are still on, don't forget to fill out the survey at the end. You will be entered into the drawing for the dove hunt and the Yeti cooler. I think that's all we have, Amanda. I appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.
My pleasure.